Hello, my name is Maddie Boardman and I'm a solution-focused hypnotherapist at Old Town Hypnotherapy in Swindon. Today I'm going to be tackling the very large subject of post-traumatic stress disorder in a little video, or attempting to. Post-traumatic stress disorder is regarded still as a medical mystery. We don't fully understand it, and it used to be described as a hidden wound, first recognised in military personnel. And it's been called lots of different things over the years, things like shell shock, we've probably all heard of that one, combat disease, and soldier's heart, when they thought it was something to do with the cardiovascular system. It used to be associated exclusively with war veterans, but we've learned it can affect anybody of any age, and actually 1 in 13 of us will go on to develop PTSD at some point during our lives. Approximately 70% of people suffer what is described as a trauma in their lives. Now, trying to define a trauma is slightly tricky, but we can describe it as a very stressful, a very frightening, very distressing event that threatens life or bodily integrity. And a trauma, it's hard to define because it's not an objective phenomenon. It's very much determined by an individual's personal response to that event rather than to the event itself. For example, we won't all have the same reaction to a natural disaster or something like a pandemic. Some of us might find it very traumatic and some of us might cope pretty well with it. But around 20% of people who suffer a trauma go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are risk factors associated with being in that 20% that develop PTSD. Experiencing repeated traumas in your life makes you more at risk of PTSD. Experiencing physical pain during the trauma makes you more at risk of developing PTSD. And not having an adequate support system, a support network around you after the event, also puts you at risk. The symptoms of PTSD are often nightmares and flashbacks of the trauma, avoidance of conversations and memories and triggers of the event. The sufferer can feel very anxious, very irritable, have trouble sleeping, have trouble concentrating. And today I'm just going to look at 3 slightly lesser known facts about post-traumatic stress disorder. And the first fact I'm going to touch on is the genetic link, the hereditary link to post-traumatic stress disorder, which doesn't actually come as a huge surprise because there are a number of other mental health disorders that are genetically linked, such as depression can run through families. So post-traumatic stress disorder has got this idea that there's some kind of hereditary link, but when we look into it, it's really quite fascinating the way it manifests. There are certain studies that have been done on individuals who have experienced traumatic events, and it has been noted that their offspring, their children, are more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, even though they didn't experience a traumatic event just through their parents. There was a study done on Rwandan genocide survivors, and the study showed that the children of Rwandan genocide survivors were more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. They had a higher risk associated. And there is, the research suggests a hereditary predisposition to developing post-traumatic stress disorder that alone can explain up to 30% of PTSD cases. Further studies have been done on Vietnam veterans and Holocaust survivors, which show a similar pattern with that study I mentioned, in that their children are at higher risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder. So we can see that there is something genetic going on. The children are getting some kind of marker that's happening, and it's possible that a traumatizing event may lead to some kind of chemical marker on our genetics, and this marker can be passed down through generations. In 2013, there was another study, this time on rats, that supported this theory. It's quite interesting. So they did a study with rats, and they exposed these rats to a smell, and then they followed it up with an electric shock. And unsurprisingly, the rats developed a fear to the smell. Every time they felt the smell, they anticipated the shock, and they had a fear response to the smell. What was really interesting was the offspring of these rats had a similar fear response to the smell, despite having never experienced the shock. So the research and the studies certainly suggest something is passed on to the children at a genetic level. There are other theories. Carl Jung, he was the founder of analytical psychology, and he theorized of the idea of a collective unconscious within humans that is an ancestral wisdom that's passed down. And we all have this collective unconscious that we inherit from our ancestors. And there's another study to support this that I've mentioned previously, actually, in one of my other posts. I think it was the arachnophobia one. And this study involved babies, 6-month-old babies, and they were shown a collection of photographs, and their pupil dilation was measured as an indication of their fear response. And this is because the chemical noradrenaline, which is released during our fight or flight fear response, increases our pupil dilation. So on seeing images of flowers, the baby's pupils dilated by 0.03 millimeters. But when they saw images of snakes or spiders, their pupils dilated 0.14 millimeters. So these findings suggest that we're born with some kind of inbuilt fear of certain dangers. Fact number 2, women are more at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder than men. In fact, women are more than twice as likely to experience PTSD than men, despite the fact that men statistically experience more traumatic events in their lives. So, out of 100 women, 10 of them suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, compared to out of 100 men, just four men would develop post-traumatic stress disorder. But of course, we must not simplify or stereotype by sex alone. But some characteristics are more common in women than they are in men. And from a neuroscientific perspective, it is interesting to look at why there may be this disparity between the sexes. So, one explanation is that the traumatic events that men experience during their lifetimes are more likely to be violence, combat, fire, disaster, death and injury. The traumatic experiences that women are more likely to experience in their lifetimes are things like child abuse, sexual abuse, sexual assaults, domestic violence. And this type of trauma, bodily integrity, this type of trauma is more likely to result in a heightened emotional suffering. The statistics show around 50% of sexual assault survivors suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And this figure is even higher when we're talking about children. During a sexual assault, a victim is often overpowered and therefore unable to use their fight or flight response. And instead, the brain may defer to the freeze response and disassociate from the assault. Now, this disassociation, this is when the mind separates itself from the experience. It has a very strong link, this disassociation, with post-traumatic stress disorder. Women who've been assaulted sexually or violently are also much more likely to be disbelieved, and they often blame themselves and they view themselves negatively, which can exacerbate their reaction to the trauma. Another possible explanation as to why men suffer less post-traumatic stress disorders than women is that men are less likely to fit the current diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Men are less likely to report feelings of anxiety or feelings of depression, but they are more likely to report behavioural issues like drug abuse and violence. We also know that men and women handle situations that are stressful. We handle them differently. Men are more likely to use the fight or flight response when faced with stress, while women are more likely to rely on what we like to call the tend and befriend response. And the tend and befriend response is a process of caring for and reaching out to others to ease their personal distress. So women may rely on support from others during a traumatic event or in the aftermath. And if that support is not available or is inadequate, then they are more at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder. Much more research is needed to understand fully why women are experiencing more PTSD than men. But certainly, biological, environmental, and coping strategies are all factors. Now, the third fact that I'm going to talk about today is what is called delayed onset post-traumatic stress disorder. When someone experiences a traumatic event, it's generally believed that if they're going to develop PTSD, they will fairly quickly afterwards. But actually we've discovered that up to a quarter of sufferers of post-traumatic stress disorders do not develop symptoms for months, if not years, after the actual event. So this delayed onset of their symptoms. And again, this isn't fully understood as to why this happens in some people, but there are some theories as to why this may happen. So it's possible, if we look at war veterans, for example, when they suffer a traumatic event during combat, what was identified that they didn't start experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder until they got back home. And it was theorised that this was because experiencing a stress response whilst in a combat situation could well be life-threatening. So it only manifested when they were safely back at home. So we can see that there's that idea that we delay it until we're in a safe environment. Sorry, my spaniel's just turned up. Hello. More recently, it's been suggested that traumatising events impact an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is, if you know any of our other videos, is part of that primitive mind, that security guard at the back of our brain. And the hippocampus is responsible for memories and emotions. And a malfunction in this area of the brain prevents memories being processed properly and can impact how memories are stored. And this could explain symptoms like flashbacks and also make the memory itself less accessible to conscious thought. Shush. We also know that memories can change over time, and it's possible that the memory of trauma can actually get worse as we remember over time. We remember that the primitive part of the brain doesn't know the difference between imagination or reality, and every time we relive that event, the memory we know is notoriously unreliable, and if it's worsening this memory over time, it can result in post-traumatic stress disorder being triggered or emerging. Well, post-traumatic stress disorder is, I find it fascinating, and it's very complex, and really I've just very much skimmed the surface today. If you or anyone you know is experiencing symptoms, please seek help. Visit your GP. Treatment is available. Several of us at Old Town Hypnotherapy have undergone specialist training in this area, and we use specialist techniques when a client presents with post-traumatic stress disorder. We offer free initial consultations for anybody who would like to get to know any more about what it is we do, so feel free to get in touch. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.